I looked up at Holst as almost a god, and you felt that he was getting to your very soul when he looked at you. You knew exactly that he was absolutely right. He was seeing right almost into your brain. He was my mentor, not only in composition, but in harmony and counterpoint, and other things outside music too, because he was a sort of widely versed personality that a lesson could be anything but music sometimes. We talk about literature or politics or anything.
Gustav Holst is known throughout the world as the composer of the planets, but to those who knew him personally, he was much more than a great composer. In this rare interview, recorded more than 40 years after his death, composer Edmund Rubbra remembers the man, the teacher, and the friend who shaped his life.
I first knew the music of Holst in, I suppose, 1918 or thereabouts, when I was still in Northampton, which was my hometown. It came about in a curious way. I was having lessons from my teacher, piano teacher, who had a vast library of music. And while I was waiting for my lesson one day, he put me into his library, and I wasn't given to sitting still under these circumstances, and I roamed round his shelves and found what was a very curious titled work, the Rigveda Hymns, by Gustav Holst, as he was then known. I was so intrigued because I was interested in Eastern things generally at that time. I was so intrigued by the title that I asked my teacher if I could borrow it. And I remember going through these Rigveda hymns with enormous excitement. They revealed quite a new type of music for me, who had been brought up in a with modern music of the Impressionist type. And I knew nothing more about him for some years after. I happened to be a pupil of Evelyn Howard-Jones in London later, and he said to me, and Cyril Scott, I was a pupil of Cyril Scott for composition. And one day he said to me, would you like to go in for a composition scholarship at Reading University? Oh, I said yes. Only to find, to my extraordinary delight, that Holst was a teacher there. So I went there like that without knowing that I was going to Holst, and it couldn't have been a better move from my point of view. Well, now, the thing that I remember most about his teaching, which surprised me, he used no textbook whatever. He wouldn't have anything to do with them. How was I to learn counterpoint if he didn't? And the same with harmony. But what he did was to go to music that he was interested in, which was mostly 16th and 17th century music, and put the music in front of me and deduce from that music the contrapuntal methods. So in a sense it was an alive approach, not a dead one. He always thought of textbooks as being a resume of what people had done, but that was all. It wasn't an alive approach of getting at contrapuntal techniques through the music itself. So we studied the Elizabethan composers that he was keen on, Byrd, Wilkes, I remember, he was particularly keen on, Vittoria amongst the Italians. He put Vittoria, by the way, above Palestrina, from his point of view. It's interesting, and Purcell. So I got to know the music of those composers very thoroughly, not only by hearing them, as much as one could, because he did perform them at his Whitsuntide festivals, but analysing them and getting to know how their counterpoint worked. And that was most invaluable. When we were when I was at Reading University, the planets were beginning to be known in the early 1920s. And whenever I could possibly go to hear the planets, I would hear it, because I was immensely excited by it, and still am. He wouldn't talk about his own music. The only occasion I was put into touch with his music, this was at Reading, I think, was a work which he had the proofs of and hadn't time to correct them. And he said, "Would you do this for me?" It was settings of some Greek words, I think, in translation. And that was the only occasion when he put his music in front of me. Whenever I took anything to him, particularly an orchestral score, he would say, well, the next thing you do is to take out all the unnecessary notes, which was a very great discipline, to see if in taking all those notes away, one arrived at something which was not only simpler, but more effective. So, as I've said on many occasions, we paired to the bone what I took to him. I remember one extraordinary instance of this at Reading University. I took to him a work for piano and orchestra, and there was a terrific problem which we discussed in it, but we couldn't resolve it. I thought, well, we'll talk about it next lesson in a week's time. But before that next lesson, I'd had a card from Holst with the solution, his solution on it, so that it showed, you see, that he didn't forget his pupils' problems during the intervening time, which I think is remarkable for a man of his ability and what he was doing at the time, to hold the composer's, the pupil's work in his mind and solve it for him. It wasn't a solution which he insisted upon. It was his solution for us to talk over, but the very fact that he did it was interesting. He was somewhat untidily dressed, rather like a smaller Vaughan Williams. He was slightly podgy, and but the interesting and most noticeable feature were his eyes. He had very strong glasses, and they were piercingly direct eyes, and you felt that he was getting to your very soul when he looked at you, or when he criticized something you were doing and he looked at you, you knew exactly that he was absolutely right. He was seeing right almost into your brain. He put me onto the novels of Joseph Conrad, which I didn't know. He was particularly fond of one called Lord Jim, which I read. He was enormously fascinated by Conrad. And then I know he told me about a sociological book by Benjamin Kidd. I've forgotten its name, but he was one of the very early socialists. Because Holst, you see, belonged to the Hammersmith socialist group at one time. And in all sorts of ways, he introduced me to literature that I hadn't known hitherto. I once took him a setting, I believe it was of Walt Whitman words, and I set it for piano, I think it was piano, and two tenors. Why I chose two tenors, I just don't know at the moment. I can't remember. But Holst looked at this score without saying a word for several minutes. I was wondering what on earth he was going to say. He looked up at me, and with those piercing eyes of his, he said, "But are there two tenors?" That I shall never forget. Remain static. Another composer could have rested on his laurels with the planets, but not so with Holst. In fact, I rather feel that Holst hadn't a good opinion of the planets sometimes by what he said. At any rate, he didn't stand still. He went on experimenting, and that's part of his philosophy. Go on evolving through tackling something which is a little beyond your powers each time. So you've always got something to stretch your imagination. You see, the planets has caught the public's imagination, largely probably through the title. I don't know. It's a marvellous idea anyway, and an original one. And it's become increasingly popular as time has gone on, and I can't quite see what other work could attain that popularity. One thinks of the choral symphony, which is a marvellous work, I think. The opening of it is one of the supreme things in British music of the 20th century. But I can't imagine it being as popular as the planets. It's remoter in a way. I suppose remoteness is a characteristic one could say of Holst's later work. Rather than cold or passionless, it's remote. But one's got to come into contact with it and on its own terms. There's a lyric movement for viola, which I think is a splendid work, but it's hardly known. And the later canons that he wrote, experimental canons, each voice of which is in a different key. It's a marvellous tour de force, both of harmony and counterpoint. I think they're quite remarkable. Simplicity was always the keynote of his teaching. Make everything practical and simple. He would have no truck, for instance, with an instrument going out of its most effective register, as they do in the avant-garde music of today. Whether he was right in that, I just don't know. But he said always, from the scoring point of view, everything comes off better if the instruments are used in their most effective compass. My last meeting with Holst was in the year he died, when he was quite ill. But he kept his interest in what I was doing to the very end. And I just finished a violin and piano sonata, and he was anxious to hear it. He couldn't get anywhere to hear it, so I remember myself and a violinist went over to play it to him where he was, somewhere in West London, but I can't remember the address. And he kept up his enthusiasm right to the very end. It was remarkable, really. I was engaged at that time on a Sinfonia Concertante for piano and orchestra. I'd finished 2 movements, I think, and the last one I wrote as a prelude and fugue in memoriam, Gustav Holst. It affected the 3rd movement of that work. I was immensely, distressed by his passing.